So, Lindsay, when I think about, I'm gonna channel my inner Jefferson and Madison here, if there is any inner Jefferson or Madison, to channel. I'm imagining them when they read this address and they've created the first political opposition, and then all of a sudden Washington is coming out and saying we can't have political opposition in essence, right? To me, to Jefferson and Madison, that would seem to be a very partisan, address or statement. And I find it, and what's amazing, I think maybe it's because it's Washington. He's so masterful that the way this is remembered through the ages is that is nonpartisan, right? I don't know. I wonder if you have some thoughts about that and the reaction or the kind of bind that Washington put Madison and Jefferson in.
Yeah, it's such a great question because you're right. They totally saw this as a political statement, and they totally saw him as condemning their actions and their activities. And they thought he was really placing blame for a lot of the challenges at the time at their feet, basically. And I think that opinion was shared by a lot of other Democratic Republicans at the time. I think that it's remembered as a nonpartisan address for a couple of reasons. So first of all, of course, it's Washington. So that does tend to smooth things over in the history books over time. But also the party part is initially less remembered than the fact that what he's doing is he's announcing his retirement. He's announcing the fact that he's leaving power. He's walking away from what would absolutely be a third term. Maybe it wouldn't be unanimous in its election this time, but it would 100% be a third term. And no one had ever done that. This was, he had already given up power once at the end of the revolution. He was the American Cincinnatus, and he was doing it again. And that was bananas. And so I think that allowed a lot of people to sort of, not unlike when we have a political figure that leaves, or even when, this is going to sound terrible, but like when there's a funeral and we talk about the great things that people do, and politicians and presidents, we sort of gloss over their not so nice parts and we focus on the good things about them and we say nice things. I think that was a lot of people's reaction to this. If they didn't agree with him politically, they were saying, oh, he's such a good man, he's retiring, we'll kind of ignore the parts we don't like.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think you nailed it. And I wonder, you talked about Adams's position in all of this and being late to find out, and can you talk a little bit about his ambitions kind of behind the scenes, and whether he is anticipating this, or whether I assume he wants to be president. Just
I'm not sure that he knows is the honest answer. So I have to say, so after writing the book about George Washington, who, was so meticulous about what he wrote and so meticulous about what he said most of the time, to then go to John Adams is hilarious, because I suspect if we had George's letters to Martha, we would have a better sense of who he, like the snarky, conniving side of him. We would have a little bit more sense of that. We get all of that with John. And so he is just such a different figure. And so it's been really entertaining to have that dichotomy. But so basically what happens in 1796 is Washington tells his secretaries that he's going to retire. One of them, I don't know who, but one of them lets slip to Adams that this is the case. Adams hears rumors from other people as well. George does not confirm it to Adams until March. They are at a state dinner. Adams stays late. Washington talks to him. Adams, interestingly, says it's like the most open conversation they've ever had, and this is 8 years into his presidency. So it's kind of saying something about their relationship. Adams goes home after the end of the congressional session in May. He does not hear anything from Washington. It wasn't unusual for them to not correspond in the summer, so that's not irregular. However, Washington provides no update, no heads up that this address is coming. And in fact, the way that Adams learns about it is twofold. It is reprinted in every newspaper across the country. So it's reprinted in Massachusetts newspapers. But Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, does basically cut out like a clipping and mails it to him on the 19th and was like, thought you might want to see this. Which, yes, I think it would be relevant. Adams has very mixed feelings. He does believe that sort of he is the natural heir, that he has been a very loyal vice president, which he has. He has been waiting in the wings very quietly, which he has. And it is sort of the natural honor to give him after decades and decades of public service and commitment to the nation. He also worries about the criticism. He has a very thin skin. He thinks maybe he would be happier just being a farmer. Well, now when I say farmer, he would farm during the day and then like read Cicero and philosophy at night. So, go figure.
Farmer.
Yeah, exactly. But he loved it. He loved playing in the dirt. He loved building walls. He loved doing all those things. In fact, the summer of 1796, when he is not hearing about the farewell address, he has this whole like dissertation on the different types of worms. Anyway, he clearly, I'm in the details of this thing. So he sort of has conflicting opinions. He's not sure what he would prefer to do. He is more than happy to be president. He's more than happy to go home. He's not willing to be vice president again, is basically where he draws the line. So if he's not going to be president, he wants to retire and be done with it, and is both deeply excited about the honor and sort of the challenge, and worried about it, and worried about the criticism, and worried about his reputation. And what he most worries about is if he loses, then having to sit in Philadelphia for several months while people laugh at him before he goes home.
That's great. And like you said, there's all these great connections to today. And, I think that as you described it, and you described in your talk, for so long, we described 1800 and 1801 as the first peaceful transfer of power. But it's really 1796, 1797, because Washington and Adams aren't that close. I mean, they are kind of in the same camp.
Yeah, they're not. And, keep in mind, when we look at the Constitution, none of this is really written down. So all of these processes have to be built from scratch. They have to be crafted. So everything from, on February 8th, when they opened the electoral returns, they'd heard rumors about who had won and had a pretty good sense. But John Adams is reading the electoral returns that say that he has won. And then afterwards, he sends a letter to the Senate and says, pursuant to what has happened, I'm announcing that I'm going to show up on March 4th and take the oath. So that in and of itself has to be confirmed. When Washington arrived at the inauguration, some people were shocked because there wasn't a precedent for that kind of thing. There wasn't any sort of practice. And so there were all of these eyes on him about how was he going to act as a private citizen? Was he sort of, happy? Was he smirking? So all of the practices around what that transfer looks like, how you're supposed to behave, that all has to be done from the very beginning. And it's incredibly nerve-wracking. In fact, Adams basically goes radio silent from February basically 15th to March 4th, because he's holed up in his room trying to figure out what the heck is he going to say at this inauguration. And, Washington's first inauguration isn't really a model because it's the shortest inauguration. He basically says, I'm really honored. The Constitution is great. I don't have any recommendations because I'm not in the office yet, so I'll let you know. And that's basically what his inauguration is. So just this whole concept is so much more anxiety ridden than I think we appreciate.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we have some wonderful comments and questions that have come in.
Awesome.
Jennifer asked a really smart question, and I think a tough question to answer. And she asked whether we should consider Washington a federalist or no party at all.
It is a really hard question. I'm going to sort of back into it. Post-retirement, Washington is 100% a federalist. He is actually at his most partisan once he has left the presidency, and I think actually makes some of his worst choices post-presidency. He really undermines civil authority and undermines the presidency. So he's definitely a federalist from 1797 to 1799. I think he's a federalist from 1794 on. I think the Whiskey Rebellion is a turning point for him because he blamed the Democratic Republican societies for instigating the Whiskey Rebellion. I don't really think fairly, but he understood that there were a lot of overlaps in the political virtues and values of the rebels and the Democratic Republican societies. And he blamed them, and he made it, I think, more political than it was. And that was a turning point for him.
Yeah, I like that answer, because the retirement, you're right. He's definitely a federalist in the retirement. But I
kind of
agree that
in his retirement.
Yeah, but I think you can date it even a little bit earlier. Yeah, so David has a great question, thinking about Adams and Hamilton, and of course they have their own rivalry. And how does the farewell address play anything into that at all? The machinations that are going on between Adams and Hamilton?
The farewell address, of course, does not name a successor. It does not endorse the particular candidate. That is because it is trying not to be a political address, but one can understand why maybe Adams would take umbrage at that. It also, as I said, sort of kicked off the election season. Now, at the time, as you all probably know, it was not appropriate for candidates to campaign on their own behalf. So Adams stayed at home at Quincy. Jefferson was in Charlottesville. Jefferson refused to even mention the election until December, and Madison went radio silent on Jefferson, didn't talk to him for 6 months because he was afraid that Jefferson would reject his campaign. So Madison just didn't give him an opportunity to talk about it at all. So, it's sort of a weird dynamic. And I think that Hamilton's knowledge that this address was coming ahead of time enabled him to start to plan his strategy, which was to try and get all of the New England voters, New England delegates, to vote equally for Adams and Timothy Pinckney, and then to get the Southern voters to vote for Pinckney, but to throw away a couple of votes for Adams, thus putting Pinckney in front of Adams and making him president and making him he would be a more pliable president than Hamilton. Now, a lot of the New England delegates got word of this plan, and so they threw away Pinckney votes and voted for some of their own local people, which was why Jefferson came in second and became the vice president. And then this plan made its way back to Adams. So that was really one of they didn't have a great relationship to begin with. That made it a whole lot worse. But I think that because Hamilton had this advanced knowledge of what was happening, he was able to sort of start to put in some of these machinations in place before other people did.
That's, man, even more intrigue than we have today, I think.
And the part of that election that we don't necessarily think about is that the French minister basically outright endorses Jefferson and tries to kind of threaten the United States. So France is full on involved in this election in a way that is wildly inappropriate. And so, the parallels are just extraordinary.
Yeah. And we actually have an international question. Jennifer asks about any international reception or traction or attention that the farewell address got.
Yeah, so it was, it was pretty common at the time for newspapers to go back and forth across the Atlantic, and for editors on both sides of the Atlantic in Paris and London and the United States to sort of take clippings and then reprint them as a way to share international news. The farewell address was no different. As I said, it was reprinted in every single newspaper in the United States, but it was also reprinted in a lot of international newspapers, and only served to heighten Washington's reputation, to make sort of the myth and the legend even greater, because in Europe there was even less of a tradition of handing over power peacefully and willingly. So there's that great quote that I don't know if he actually said it, but there's this quote that's attributed to King George III, which is that if he gives up power, he'd be the greatest George in the world. I don't know if he actually said that. I don't remember when he said that, but that was definitely the idea that there was this real sense of disbelief that he was standing down again.
Yeah. And my understanding is, George says that the first time in 1783, or I guess he would have learned about it in 1784 after Washington stepped down the first time. But then you're right, he says it a version of that again when he finds that Washington has stepped down again. That, you know, he'll be the greatest man in the world. I guess George the third's like, well, this comment worked the first time. Well,
George is a fan of George.
That's right. Okay, great. So we have a couple more. Patrick has a question piggybacking on the point about France and asking about whether all the points about foreign affairs, if we kind of read between the lines, whether they're actually a defense of the Jay Treaty, and if we read the address as a partisan document, as I said we should, is it kind of a move against interfering with the Jay Treaty and this not quite an alliance with Britain, but a thawing of relations with Britain?
So I think it is informed by the contemporary moment in two ways. It is, on one hand, it is absolutely a defense of the administration's measures. One of the other things that I'll flag for you guys, the section where Washington talks about the importance of public credit, that's basically a defense of Hamilton's financial legislation, which Washington, of course, oversaw. So he was in some ways defending this treaty as important to put relations with all nations on good and equal footing. The second piece, I think, is not so much Jay Treaty specific, but it's that the parties had become so closely identified with foreign nations and their sympathies. So the Democratic Republican was pro-France, the Federalist Party was pro-Britain. And Washington recognized that that was really dangerous because it meant that neither side was going to be making purely rational diplomatic choices. And so he felt that both of those really intense sympathies were to be avoided and were very deeply problematic. So certainly he sort of had the more recent example of 1783 with the neutrality crisis and citizen Edmond Charles Genet from France stirring up all sorts of trouble and chaos literally in the port of Philadelphia, 6 blocks from Washington's house, and the pro-French sympathies by the American people. But he did recognize that those really more intense partisan ideas were present on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one might argue that the part about no foreign attachments might have been the most influential part of the address in terms of just policy. And I loved how you said that, he doesn't say no entangling alliances. And as you know, it's Jefferson that says that. So even Jefferson is picking up on that sentiment and repeating it in his own language.
No, you're right. I mean, I do think it becomes sort of the primary maxim in American diplomacy, at least for a while. If we think about sort of the various doctrines and corollaries that I'm sure you guys, I think a bunch of them are actually in your, humanities standards, but if we think about, if Washington is setting it up as no permanent alliances, roughly, then Monroe is basically saying, hands off the Western hemisphere, and Theodore Roosevelt is basically saying we will enforce that. So they're building on Washington's ideas that there shouldn't be these entangling situations. So it really was a dominating philosophy, and I think actually Washington is not saying that the United States should never participate in global affairs or should never intervene in an international situation. He's saying that there should be no sort of permanent intervention, which I think is actually a diplomatic idea that as a country we're returning to, recognizing that we can't be everywhere all the time and stay there permanently. And we need to sort of rethink whether that's a smart strategy. So I think that, Washington is a very flawed man. He made mistakes. He made poor choices, but the farewell address is I think the most prescient document, at least from the 18th century, maybe ever, in that it's kind of frightening about its forward thinkingness.
Yeah, well, that's why we had to include it in the founding documents.
I was so glad you did.
And it was a good excuse to bring you into the series too.
Excellent. Also appreciate that.
So a couple quick last things, and then we're going to get to the documents. I want to give Kelly the last word because she has a great comment on here, but I have to sneak in this question because I know you're a fan of Hamilton like I am. One last time, how accurate, how useful maybe to teach the address for these teachers?
Oh, such a good song. It's really hard for me not to actually like break into song when thinking about it. So I think that it is remarkably helpful for a couple of reasons. First, the document really was a reflection of Hamilton and Washington's partnership. Hamilton, of course, writes the draft, but Washington is so particular about what he wants included, what he doesn't want included, how he wants it to be crafted, the sort of the tone of it. And then he gets it back from Hamilton and he makes his own tweaks. So this is not Hamilton's creation. It's very much a partnership. Second of all, the part where Washington says we need to teach them how to say goodbye, like it's so true. And it's I often will tell students, clearly I feel very strongly about this subject, but I'll encourage students to look at Article 2, which is the article that looks at the presidency. It is very short. There is very little written down. There's still very little written down. And so much of our political system is based on norm and custom. And that has to start somewhere, and it has to be gradually accepted over time. And that's how we get basically political structures that don't have any words to them. Washington starts so much of that process, including the process of figuring out how to retire. And so I love that focus of the song because that's such an essential part of what he was trying to do.
That's great. Yeah, this thing we've talked about so much over recent years, the political norms, right? He starts to establish what we call political norms. And if he would have stayed in office, we know that he dies in December of 1799. He probably would have died in a different way if he would have been in Philadelphia. But all of a sudden the presidency looks like a lifetime office, right? He dies in his third term, and then what happens to the Republic? And that kind of gets to Kelly's comment that this is just an oppressive act. And the way that you just described it, I think captures it really well, that so many people in history don't show any restraint and don't step down, even if he was getting old and even if he didn't want the job in the first place. It was a great gift, I think, to the country.
I completely agree. And I'm really glad, Kelly, that you emphasize that, because I often say when I'm talking about the creation of the presidency, which is the title of another talk that I often give, I don't think anyone else could have been the first president just because of where the nation was. And Washington was the only person that really had the national reputation to hold all of those pieces together. But by stepping down, he recognized that the office had to be bigger than him. It couldn't be a personal office. It had to be an institution. And he was intentionally saying that he was not the only person that should hold the role or could hold the role. I mean, after he had sort of filled it initially. And that is a remarkably humble thing to say. One perhaps that some Supreme Court justices could learn from, that, institutions are supposed to be bigger than people. It's not about the person, it's about the office. And that is, I think, it is a remarkably astute judgment that he made.
Absolutely. All right. So we're on a roll.